In the meantime, we were joined by John Macomber, who's a senior lecturer at Harvard University. I'll talk a bit more about John and his work in a second, but reflecting on the morning, I think we heard very interesting talks, pitches about the characteristics of green building, healthy buildings, the characteristics, but also the effects of the characteristics on health outcomes, on mental health outcomes, and then ultimately the technology that we can have to improve buildings. But at the same time, as real estate investors, as real estate developers, as asset owners like pension plans, and we probably all of us here have public pension plans that invest our money, we care about the euros and the cents or the dollars and the cents. So the big question is, do healthy buildings make dollars and cents? And that's why it's so great to have John here today. John is a true visionary, because just before COVID came out, and he'll talk more about this in a second, he released a book together with Joe Allen, who comes more from a public health perspective, and John really comes from a real estate investment development perspective. They jointly released a book called Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity. And I'm not sure which market you were on in China, John, where you kind of picked up on that COVID, but you may have been the one that brought it into the US, because it certainly made sure that your book became a bestseller very, very quickly. And for those of you who haven't read it, there's actually a new version now, it just came out, that also incorporates some of the learnings of the pandemic. But if the pandemic taught us one thing, it's that our indoor environment can be great to us, but it can also be harmful to us through the aerosols that we spread if we have COVID. So John is with us, not in person, but maybe this is even better than in person, because I told John he's with us kind of in a Statue of Liberty size form. He's not going to do slides, so he's going to share his thoughts with you for about 20 minutes, then we'll do Q&A, and then we'll continue on with a panel and presentations. But kind of this section, kind of pre-afternoon coffee break, is really going to focus on the investment perspective on health in buildings, on healthy buildings. So John, thanks a lot for joining us. The floor is yours.
No, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, it was a good time for a book to come out, but it was a terrible time in society. So the thing that actually gratified us more about the book was being able to help. And Joe, in particular, was really a leader in determining that COVID was spread by aerosols, not by droplets, not by fomites, and bringing that forth. So thank you for mentioning that. And of course, we're delighted that this book is out again. I thought I would back up and talk a little bit about my background. I'm from real estate, and I'll talk about what I came to do at Harvard, and then how Joe and I came to write this book and what we think is going to happen next. So I'm originally from real estate and construction. I spent 30 years in a contracting company, primarily also investing in commercial real estate. I came originally to Harvard Business School to teach Real Estate 101, how do you build and flip an office building. I got interested also in using the same tools of dirt and cash flow and concrete and finance to think about cities and urbanization and infrastructure. And now I also do a lot of work on climate adaptation. What are we going to do if there's more heat, more sea rise, more wildfire, more drought? How do we make choices? So I'm happy to answer questions about that if you like. But let's talk about this book. So, or how I came to work with Joe on the concept of healthy buildings and what's the economic value. I had written teaching material before about biophilics or even about Vedic design, and there were owners who claimed that, yeah, it's going to be better for your building if it's healthier, or it's going to be platinum or something like that. There was no empirical evidence. So I was at a dinner at the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and this young researcher, Joe Allen, showed the CogFX study, the cognitive function study, which, as many of you know, and I imagine was discussed probably in some of the prior sessions, was a double-blind, repeatable, journal peer-reviewed experiment where volunteers did their office work in a setting where the levels of CO2, levels of particulates and VOCs were changed over the course of the day for several weeks. And they took a variety of tests, cognitive tests, that largely looked at memory, at energy, at strategy, at decision-making, things like that. every single one of the people did worse in an environment of more carbon dioxide. Of course, this is no surprise to people in this room. It's also no surprise kind of intuitively because you get kind of sleepy in a conference room. But the revelation for me as a real estate guy who'd been doing a lot of work on energy efficiency was here we are chasing pennies in energy when we're losing dollars and tens of dollars around productivity and around health. That was a revelation for me. So before I'd been working on how do you scrape out a little bit of the energy issues. So part of what Joe and I did to proceed on this was we wrote Harvard Business School teaching material, a case study, about 425 Park Avenue in New York, which is Norman Foster Building, L&L Holdings, really spectacular structure. But in particular, L&L had to make the decision around whether they should make their building as healthy as they could around indoor air quality and trying to get to very low levels of CO2 in the project, which largely meant much bigger chases and much more electric capacity for all the tenants to do their healthy buildings work. So what we modeled was what is the increase in capital cost that L&L would incur in a new build to build a healthy building. And then the flip side for me as a finance person, what do you have to believe you're going to get in added rent? Will tenants actually care? Will the tenants actually pay more? And as it turned out for L&L, their top level tenants do want to pay more, and they were willing to pay. And it only had to be 1 or 2% more in rent to have a building that's demonstrably healthier than other buildings. So I'll talk in a little bit about how do you know it's demonstrably healthier. And I know you have a session coming up about measurement and sensors, and so that will apply as well. So we knew that was the case with L&L. And then, of course, there became a true natural experiment where COVID happened. And when L&L spent the money on the project, they thought, well, in a good market, we'll get a rent premium. In a down market, we may not get the premium, but we'll get the tenant. So our vacancy experience will be better. And that's indeed what happened. So as you see now, at least in New York, post-pandemic, the non-healthy buildings can't move at all. And many of them are totally vacant because if you have a building with non-operable windows and undersized ventilation, like who wants that? And in comparison, new buildings like the new JP Morgan building, also Norman Foster project, have the CEO, Jamie Dimon, is touting the healthiness of the building. Now, I'm not sure if that's branding or if it's recruiting for employees, or if they actually think people will work better. Either way, that's the situation. And for everybody in this room, of course, you're aware of that. For me as an academic, and for many of you as investors, the question is not whether elite people in elite cities, in elite areas, will invest in healthy buildings. Yeah, they will. How will this propagate? How will this go through the rest of this huge industry out into these much smaller buildings and much more cost strained buildings? So let me talk a little bit about our pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID experience in that regard, and how the knowledge propagated. So the pre-COVID part I talked about is around cognition. During COVID, the initial reaction of all of us, I think, was like, what is going on here? How do you catch this? Do you get it from close contact? Do you get it from things on your mail or in your groceries? Do you get it from sneezes? And ultimately, it turned out that COVID is transmitted through aerosols. And I imagine most of you know this as well, but it means that what you breathe stays up in the air. And a way to think about it is that COVID spreads in a room like cigarette smoke spreads in a room. So if you think about being in the other corner of a room where somebody's smoking, you can smell that coming across. It stays in the air. That's the kind of way that COVID is really transmitted. So this was an important discovery by my colleagues at the School of Public Health and by others at the Lancet and elsewhere. So what this meant is you need to think about, during COVID, a hierarchy of controls. And a lot of you were very involved in this in ways that are painful to remember, and I hope you're not having to do it now. But the hierarchy of controls is essentially a public health construct where you first eliminate the peril. That essentially means either lock everybody down or vaccinate everybody. If you can't do both of those things, then the next most compelling piece in the hierarchy is to substitute for the peril. And this was essentially during early COVID, when only essential workers could go out, transit workers grocery workers, people like that, not the others. The next level in the hierarchy is engineering controls. Engineering controls is where a lot of us in the room are involved. And that's when you're thinking about filtration, about point source ionization, about UV, about opening the windows, about swabbing down the elevators and things like that. The next piece in the hierarchy of controls, the fourth, is in some ways less effective, but also less costly, and that's administrative controls. Administrative controls are work from home, people come on alternate days, people are 6 feet apart, there's a special line at the salad bar and things like that. They're all things that don't require a big capital outlay, but they do require some attention. And finally, before there was a vaccine, the last level of control was the PPE, the personal protective equipment. So this hierarchy of eliminate the peril, substitute for the peril, engineering controls, administrative controls, PPEs, also happens to map on how expensive it is. It's super expensive to eliminate the peril, particularly to lock people down. That's expensive in the global economy. And then most of you are involved in balancing the engineering controls and the administrative controls. So as you saw, big landlords, big cruise ships, big restaurants, big hotel chains, they could go heavy on the engineering controls because they had the capital to do it, to say we'll come out and we'll upgrade our filters, we'll run the fans more often, we'll add stairs or something like that. Generally, what we saw in the less valuable buildings, I guess I would say, if somebody can't afford to spend another $10 a square foot on some kind of engineering control, was the administrative controls on scanning people, on taking your temperature on the way in, on getting various other elements of controlling how people behave and come to the office and those kind of things. So that was the trade-off. So that's, let me take a drink, take a breath. Let me think of, for those of you who are not native English speakers, digest what I said.